wait for a couple more minutes for some of the students to log in. Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening from Los Angeles. Our guest lecture today is part of the Archaeology of Taiwan and Southeast Asia Maritime Worlds, a class offered both at UCLA, which is actually completed in the winter quarter, and we're continuing as part of an ongoing course offering at the International Program of Austronesian Studies at the National Chengchi University in Taipei, Taiwan. This talk is co-sponsored by the UCLA Asia Pacific Center through the Taiwan Studies Lectureship, the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and the Center for Taiwan Philippines Indigenous Knowledge, Local Knowledge, and Sustainable Studies at the National Chengchi University. By the way, I'm Stephen Acabado. I'm an associate professor of anthropology here at UCLA and the director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to recognize that as a land-grant institution, the Asia Pacific Center and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. Our speaker today is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the National Taiwan University, Taipei, Taiwan. She has been working on exploring the human-environment interactions and the process of the formation of different social relations of the Neolithic societies in northern Taiwan through the analysis of curated materials and conducting various excavations. In addition, she is an advocate of community archaeology and collaborative research with indigenous communities in Taiwan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chiwa Chang, who will share her work on the human-environment entanglements in the Late Neolithic Yilan Plain, a case study from the Wansan site, Yilan County.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. And first, I want to thank Stephen and Dr. Guan for inviting me to give this talk. And it's my honor to, it's really during this pandemic, I have the opportunity to talk to different audiences. Otherwise, I usually talk about this topic in Taiwan. So I'll start sharing my screen. So here's the topic of my talk, the human environment entanglements in the Late Neolithic Yilan Plain, a case study from the Wansan site. And here's the photo of the site when it was excavated, which is the main material that I used to analyze today. And the photo is shot in 1998. And you can see on the screen that on the left-hand side, this is a small Wansan, this is the Wansan Hill. And then the excavation area is it's the little like a soil area on the left-hand side of the photo. And here's the here's the outline of my talk. First, I will introduce a little bit about the Wansan site and very large background introduction. And then the questions that I'm trying to ask through this analysis. Then I'll talk a little bit about the previous research about the site and the theoretical framework that I'm going to use to think about the data that I have about the site and to explore the dynamic interactions of the human and the environment. And later I'll present the data and the analysis, and then finally I'll give a little conclusion. Here's the location of the site. And this is the satellite image of the northern Taiwan. And the Yilan Plain is on the northeastern part of Taiwan. You can see that it's surrounded by two main mountain range. One in the north is called Snow Mountain Range, and the other one is in the south that's called Central Mountain Range. And then the mark here is the Wansan site, is the data that I'm going to analyze today. And from this satellite image, you can see that the Yilan Plain is shaped as a triangle, and that it's facing the Pacific Ocean on the east. And so during the winter time, it face the northeast monsoon, strong northeast monsoon. And then during the summertime, it will be hit by the typhoon from the south. And here's the image that was it happened in 2015 after a big typhoon hit the Yilan Plain. And you can see it's flooded the whole plain area and caused great damages. And this is just a few years ago, 2017. It's also after the typhoon hit the Yilan Plain. You can see the power poles were all fall down. And so you can imagine the big typhoons and then the high precipitation, the influence of typhoons and precipitation in this area. Even until today, it can still cause great damages to the society. And here's the satellite image of the site. It's on the this is the circle area is the Wansan Hill. And you can see it's surrounded by the plain, by the lowland plain. And then the blue square indicates the excavation conducted in 1998. And it's a large scale rescue excavation, which I will talk a little bit about later. And here's another image that is taken in 1998. The landscape is very different now. But in 1998, when we started the excavation, you can see the site is on this small hill. And then on the back of the hill, this is the image that taken from the east towards the west. And you see the mountain, the high mountain areas in the back of the Wansan Hill. And here's another image taken from the mountainside towards the sea. So you can see the ocean is actually a few kilometers, not few kilometers, kilometers away from the Wansan Hill. And you see this is the hill in 1998. And the excavation area, I hope you can see it. It's on the left-hand side. And then in the central part of the hill, it's actually, now it's a Chinese cemetery. And so you see these little structures, they are a cemetery, the burial grounds. And then on the right-hand side of the hill, it's modern buildings that was constructed in 1950s. And I'll talk a little bit about the chronology of the sites. There are 40 wood charcoal samples collected from the Neolithic layer and 6 from the post-Neolithic layer was sent for dating at the radiocarbon laboratories. I applied Bayesian modeling, including the KD and phase modeling, to estimate the beginning and end dates of the occupation and to identify major trends from the radiocarbon dates. The results of phase modeling suggest that the Neolithic occupation of the hill started sometime between 2070 and 1910 BCE. So it's around 4020 to 3860 calibrated BP. So it's the green bar on the chart, and ended sometime between 770 and 540 BCE. And this is the Neolithic phase. And the other time period is the post-Neolithic phase. It started around 800 CE, but you can see there's a big gap between the Neolithic phase and the post-Neolithic phase. And here's the stratigraphy of one of the excavation unit of the Wansan site. And you can see this bottom layer is the 2 layers. It's actually what we call the cultural layers. This is the Neolithic layers. And based on the little difference between these 2 layers, we can further separate it into probably 2 temporal period, but it's not very easy to differentiate. It's also not the whole area can be differentiated stratigraphically. And then we can see there's a gap. This top layer, this layer on top of the cultural layer is the 900 CE time period that we got from the carbon dating. And here's the map of the site. This red dot number 10 is the Wansan site. And here's another site called Neolithic site. It's contemporaneous with the Wansan site. And number 11 is another Neolithic site called Dazhuwei site. And it's a little bit earlier. Then it's actually contemporaneous to the to the bottom layer of the Wansan site. And these yellow squares indicates the geological coring that been conducted in this area. Based on this geological coring, we can, a geologist was trying to reconstruct the paleo environment or the paleoclimatic conditions of this plain area. And from what we can see, the late Neolithic period archaeological site is along the more inner side of the plain area. And then there's a big temporal gap between 2500 BP to around 1600 BP. There's a gap that we cannot find any archaeological sites in this Yilan Plain until the post-Neolithic time period. So my main questions or the things that I want to explore through this analysis is why people left the Wansan site around 2500 BP. And what's the process? What kind of the process of this abandonment of the site? And it's only not happened on the site. It's actually, as I mentioned earlier, from 2500 BP towards 1600 BP. We couldn't find any archaeological sites or any archaeological artifacts in this plain area. And then around 1600 BP, we started to see human occupation along the coastal area instead of on the hill closer to the mountain area. So this big temporal gap intrigues Taiwanese archaeology for quite a while. And before, people, scholars tend to associate this lack of human occupation in this plain area to the environment changes, especially the climate change. So the idea is that increasing intensity and frequency of typhoons made this area uninhabitable for human populations. So there are several, as I mentioned earlier, geological coring in this area that people try to reconstruct the paleo environment and paleoclimatic conditions. But there are actually quite vast discrepancies in terms of the time periods among these researchers. So we can see from this, I summarize a few of the researches. The pollen from the Alpine Lake in the northern part of the Yilan Plain indicates that from 500 BCE to 500 CE, there's a cooler period during this time period. And it's actually quite a good match to the time that when people abandoned the Neolithic sites. But the other research, the formation of terraces along the Lanyang River, the geologist, based on the formation of terraces along the Lanyang River, to indicate that around 500 BCE, there were probably big typhoons that hit, which helped to form the formation of the terraces, and they date the time period to around 50 BCE. And then another pollen analysis from the archaeological sites along the coast indicate that around 50 BCE that the typhoon probably, the intensity and the frequency of the typhoon probably increased starting from this time period. And then there are lake sediments. The chemical analysis of lake sediments in the Yilan Plain indicate that the strong rainfall probably associated with typhoon during 500 to 1000 CE, which is much later than the Neolithic people left the Yilan Plain. And then there are various proxies from the Alpine Lake in the southern part of the Yilan Plain indicate that increasing precipitation during 500 to 1 BCE, which is a very huge time period. So it gives us idea either during around like 500 BC to 500 CE that the climate condition in Yilan Plain actually worsened, or it's actually the time period is much longer. It's from 1500 to 100 BCE. So in order to help me to think about this process, the reason and the process of this abandonment of the Neolithic occupation, I'm inspired by the theoretical framework that proposed by Ian Hodder, the archaeologist Ian Hodder, the entanglement, the concept of entanglement. And here I quote, he said that from the earliest of human entanglements in the world, the environment has been the production of a heterogeneous multiplicity of forces in which humans have played their part. There's no external environment impinging on a cultural system. Everything is always already entangled, so that there's only internal adjustment and adaptation. Rather than elements of a system being selected for in different environments, there's just one overall whole moving along as a mass, unhinged, unfettered, unconstrained by external limits. There's just a heterogeneous entanglement juggernaut held together by cross-cutting dependencies between stones, rivers, humans, made things, ideas, institutions, and so on. It is these internal ties and constraints that provide direction, taking the mass as a whole down particular pathways. And he further argued, and I quote, things and their interactions are unruly because things tend to fall apart, die out, transform, so that they cannot be relied upon. Of course, on the day-to-day, we manage to stabilize things, often with a lot of work. All these complex interactions and temporalities mean that humans are forever seeking new solutions. These solutions nearly always involve using new materials, new technologies, new restrictions and regulations, new forms of representation. They are additive. This is what I have discussed as path dependency. It becomes difficult, costly in economic, social, and cultural terms to disentangle things and go back to the beginning. The hypothesis is that entanglements tend to increase over the long term because of the instability of things and because of path dependencies. And when Ian Hodder talks about entanglements, I think he tries to make entanglement as a universal law or universal hypothesis that can be applied worldwide, and which I don't really think that's the case. But it's actually give me a good inspire me a way to think about the things in the Wansan Hill, the interactions between the people's Neolithic people living in the Wansan Hill and how they interact with the hills and whether this interaction actually push the people to force the people have to abandon the site after more than 1,000 years of habitation. So let me introduce the Wansan site a little bit. The site was documented in 1963, and then it stopped being researched for quite a while until the 1990s. Several test excavations was conducted in the 1990s. And then there was a large rescue excavation in 1998 due to a private construction. At that time, around 2,000 square meters was excavated. And through the excavation, we believe that the site was occupied continuously. And this can be testified by the stratigraphy and the chronology that I just showed earlier. And then it was habitation sites. We found post holes, clusters of post holes, indicating the existence of houses, and then several stone alignments, probably indicating the markings between social groups, and the hearth in different residential areas, and possible storage pits, because as you can understand, the excavation was conducted in 1998, and there is a rescue excavation. So there are a lot of things, limits our analysis later. And then the excavation was very rapid. So there are a lot of there are a lot of things that we didn't do in the field, such as the flotation, and then more fine scale excavations. This excavation was conducted during temporal and budget constraints. And so we found the possible storage pits. I put it possible here is because we don't really know the function of the pits, but it's underground pits without any artifacts inside it. And so we suspect that it might be a storage pits for organic matters. And then we found tool making workshops, and you can see on the photos on upper right-hand side. It's usually aligned in a straight, in a line shape, and then we can find unfinished tools, broken tools, depotages, and then the grinding stones and those things that are associated with lithic tools making. And then there are hundreds of artifacts associated with the daily life. And then we also found stone coffins and some jar burials at the site. And you can see on the lower right-hand side, the photo shows one of the stone coffins on the site. It's assembled by the slates that is probably acquired in the mountain areas. And these burials are not in particular assigned areas. It's actually close to the domestic area. And let me see if I have. And here's just the topographic map of the sites. And then the yellow square, yellow area on the left-hand side of the hill is the excavation area that in 1998. And you can see on the northern side and the like northwestern side of the hill is actually steep slope. So probably no Neolithic people didn't really live there. It's more probably the area for people to conduct their other activities, and we didn't really find. It's basically impossible to conduct a survey investigation in this steep slopes area. And so we hypothesized that the Neolithic people basically lived along the more soft slopes area on the western and the southern part of the hill. And here are the photos showing these different artifacts, including arrowheads, stone adze, flake tools, knives, and then the ceramic artifacts. These are the handles. There are various kinds of handles, and the majority of ceramic artifacts are ceramic jars, and then spindle whorls. And then we also found this nephrite bracelets, nephrite earrings, different kinds of ornaments that is probably imported from other places. So you can see from these images that basically the artifacts that was the utilitarian artifacts can be found at the site. And so in my analysis, I regard the Wansan Hill as things. I would explore how people modify the hill and how the nature, the slope terrain, and the fragile bedrock of the hill influences and constrains its interaction with people. By investigating the human thing-human and human-human relationship, which is proposed by Ian Harder in his theory of the entanglements, I want to demonstrate that the entanglement between the hill and people through 1,000 years made the hill vulnerable to human habitation. So in this slides, you can see the distribution of the ceramic clusters. These big circles indicates the postal clusters. As I mentioned earlier, there are several postal clusters indicating possible presence of the houses. So these are postal clusters are probably where the prehistoric Neolithic houses stands. And then the gray square indicates the existence of stone coffins. And so you can see these coffins basically encircle the houses. So it's closely associated with the domestic area. And then you see these ceramic clusters and the lithic clusters. So all these artifacts for their daily use are also closely associated in their houses, around their houses. And then we also have the possible storage pit. Here I named it as underground pit, the red circle. That is probably indicating it's some shared features that shared by different households. And then these markers indicating terraces, that's what we are going to see in the next slides. Yes. So the red arrow indicates that these are the rocks you see here are the bedrock of the hill. It's composed of the sandstone and slates, many slates. And you can see that when people occupy this hill environment, it's a slope. And then people modify the bedrock and to shape it as a terrace. And so you can see several terrace area. And the red arrow indicates where the terrace, the age of the terraces. And then people lived on these more of constructed flat areas to build up their houses and conduct their daily activities. And here's another example that I was talking about how people entangled with this hill environment. This is one of the stone coffins. And when people bury the stone coffins, they also modify the bedrock. And you can see that on this photo, they cut off the bedrock and insert the slate that is probably acquired from the other areas. And not only they cut off the modified bedrock to insert the slate to assemble the coffin, they also inserted some of the rocks that is probably part of the bedrock. And then they they cut off the bedrock and they they insert some of the rocks between the slate coffin and the bedrock in order to stabilize the stone coffins inside the bedrock. And here's another example of the stone coffins. It's smaller in size, and you can see that they assembled these different pieces of slates, which is probably can be acquired from the hill itself. And then there's no like button slates, which is we can see in the previous stone coffin. In this stone coffin, they don't put the button slate. Instead, they also modify the bedrock to into a more flat space to probably inter their deceased ancestors, and then assemble these slates and cut off the bedrock and then putting the slates to make it as a coffin. And then this is one of the possible storage pits that I mentioned earlier. It's also that people carved in underground. So you can see that they modified this bedrock. And then these storage pits usually around a meter deep. And so inside the pit, we didn't really find any artifacts, only very, very few pieces of ceramic shards and no artifacts at all. And here are some of the photos. Not only did they carve the bedrock to make it suitable for the daily for the living, they also carved the bedrock to make it as a post holes. So not only the post holes was the one that people dug into the earth, they also dug deep down into the bedrock. So you can see these different post holes that was carved down the bedrock. And here's another zooming shot of the post holes. And not only these features that Neolithic people use the hills, modify the hills for their living. They also cut off the rocks on the hill to make to assemble that as different features or make it for their different kinds of daily lives. This is one of the hearth that we found at the site. It was assembled by the rocks from the hills, and there are charcoals and the smoke marks on the charcoals on the rocks. And here's another example. The stone alignment is also made of the local rocks, the rocks from the hills. And not only the features and these different architectures and the hills itself, but also the tools that was used to carve the hills, to cut out the rocks from the bedrocks, are probably also the tools that the rocks that can be acquired from the hill. You can see there are thousands of grinding stone tools uncovered from the excavations, and they are in different shapes, and they are all the rocks that is from the hills. And you can see there are like different, it's being heavily used, and you can see different like very heavily grounded usewares. And these are the majority of the tools that we discovered on the site. So we can tell from the artifacts, the features, that I see people heavily utilized the rocks, the main part of the hill, the bedrocks of the hill, and to make it either for their structures, for their features, for their daily livings, for their for the burials, for the people that for their deceased members, and for making tools for those very mundane daily activities. So this is the site on the hill, and this photo want to show that the stratigraphy of the site. And since it's on the slope terrain, so you can imagine the influence of the slope itself, how that will influence that also, we can see it from the stratigraphy on this photo. And so you can also imagine this must also happen during the Neolithic time, when people, when Neolithic people lived here. They heavily exploited different kinds of resources on the hill, and the high precipitation that happened when they lived here must also cause the erosional problem to the people who live there, as we encounter today. So from the stratigraphy, you can see that this is one of the units on the more lower part of the slope, and you can also see this blue lines indicating the deposition of the cultural layer. And you can see the more upper part of the unit, the cultural layer is thinner, and while the lower part of the unit, the cultural layer is thicker. And based on the dating and the artifacts, we can say that actually the erosion, the problem of erosion was continuous, was a continuous process, either in Neolithic time period, even in Neolithic time period. So you can see it very clearly from here, the stratigraphy of the unit on the lower part of the excavation area. And while in the upper part of the excavation area, you see that the cultural layer is much thinner, but we can still find archaeological materials on top of the bedrock. And but it's obvious probably plenty quite thickness of the cultural layer has been washed away downwards. So for my analysis, what I would try to demonstrate is how when people started to occupy this Wansan hill, they started to use the resources on the hill and in the surrounding areas. But one of the things that they utilize the most is the lithic resources on the hill. And not only they use the lithic resources on the of the hill to make different kinds of tools, they also use this lithic resources to construct the hilly environment to make it habitable for them. And through this process, it's been like 1,000 years. This area, they construct their houses and modify the landscape and build up different kinds of things on the hill, and even bury their deceased ancestors close to their houses on the hills, and utilize the different materials of the hill to build another living spaces for their deceased members. So this long-term occupation process also make us to see through this very heavily exploited process, and then through a very long time, make the hill very become a very unhospitable environment for people's occupation. Because of this hill environment, and because of the high precipitation and the strong rainfalls during certain seasons in this plain area, and then the bedrock of the, as I mentioned earlier, the composition of the bedrock is the slate, and the majority is the slate, and then sandstone. And slate is actually easy to be weathered in this area. So this whole thing, the occupation, the interaction between the human and the environment, the Neolithic Wansan people and this Wansan hill, make the Wansan hill gradually become a place that is not that good for the occupation. So this analysis established the occupation history of the Neolithic Wansan people and how they entangled with the Wansan hill over time. The ways that they interacted with the environment materialized on them and awaiting scrutiny from archaeologists. And my study illustrates the importance of archaeological data analysis, which allows us to investigate human activities on a refined scale, both spatially and temporally. So unlike geological data that indicates that it's always a very huge temporal duration, that was very hard for us to imagine how people face the environment on a daily basis. But archaeological data can actually give us this finer scale in terms of temporal and spatial scales to actually explore the daily interactions between people and the environment. And at the Wansan site, the archaeological features, including modified terraces, post-holes, burials, and possible storage features, all indicate human intention to modify the hill for their habitation. At the same time, these actions were possible by not only human intervention, but also various things acquired from the hill. Furthermore, the placement of the deceased ancestors directly below the domestic spheres suggests the close interaction between the hill and people. And it's a very long-term interactions between these two. And the Wansan hill drew and tied people together. However, the nature and the location of the hill, here I mean that the sloping terrain, and then the nature of the slate, and the location meaning that it's on the southern side of the Yilan Plain, which easily suffers from the typhoons and the precipitation that brought about by the typhoons. So the nature and the location of the hill required human investing energy to maintain their environment habitable. And this is what we can saw through the archaeological data. As a result, we know that ancient societies, this Neolithic Wansan society, did not just passively adapt to environment change. As in the Wansan society, they may have developed technologies to manage their environment or realize the environmental challenges they had to encounter daily. So that's why they even dug down into the bedrock to erect their posts. And then they use different rocks to stabilize the stone coffins underground. And these long-term interactions between human and the environment revealed by archaeological data testify to the human ability to adjust and invent. At the same time, they also reveal the power of the environment. Here at the Wansan site, the Wansan hill, to both enable and constrain human activity. The way we think about the environmental change should not be trapped in the nature-cultural dualism. It is actually the result of long-term human-environment interactions. Employing the entanglement framework helps me to explore the nuances of human-thing interactions and forces me to rethink our roles in facing the issues of contemporary climate change. So this is my talk today. And here's some of the people and the agencies that I want to thank. And thanks for your listening.
Thank you, Professor Chang. Are there any questions from the attendees or from everyone? I know, Armand, you have a question. Would you like to ask your question? Oh. So, okay. Armand was asking if there were preserved human skeletal remains at the excavations.
That's a good question. No. Due to the nature of the soil, it's very acid there. So there are no human skeletons we found at the site. But based on the shape of the stone coffins and then the way that it was buried underground and cut into the bedrock, and also the comparing to other Neolithic the contemporaneous archaeological sites in eastern part of Taiwan, we assume that these are the stone coffins. So it's more indirect.
Thank you. And I actually have a question, very basic, and it's just my very limited knowledge about Taiwan archaeology, and
yep.
The description of Taiwan archaeological chronology and the use of the term reference to Neolithic, if that's tied in with the chronology in China, because there are specific descriptions and characteristics of the Neolithic, like having agriculture, settled villages, and emergence of pottery.
Mm-hmm. I think in Taiwan's chronology, the Neolithic indicates the making and using of the pottery. That's the common characteristic of the Neolithic societies. But whether it's agriculture or what kinds of agriculture is still debatable, and we don't really have very concrete evidence to say that there are some of the places has agriculture, but probably not all over Taiwan. So even within Taiwan, even though it's a very small island, but it's actually very diverse in terms of the prehistorical conditions in this area.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question, but Ben, hello, Ben, has a question which is related to my next question.
Yep.
And Ben writes, great talk, very interesting to see those details. Thank you. Can you tell us a little about social organization within the site, and how about the ceramic assemblage? Is it differentiated between areas of the site? And I think I might add, if anyone has looked at patterns of specialization and standardization on this ceramic assemblage.
Okay, for the site, what about social? In terms of the social organization, it's actually one of the topics that I focused on in my dissertation. I was trying to use the house society model to talk about the social organization of the sites. So based on it, I'll just explain very quickly, based on the distribution of the artifacts and its association with the postal clusters, people probably at this time organized based on the houses or the household activities. And then between these houses, there is no big differences in terms of the resources that they are able to acquire and they can use. But there are like a very distinct differentiation between the households is the ownership of specific items that was made of nephrite is a zoanthropomorphic figures that was usually buried within the burials. And in my dissertation, I used that figure to argue that some of the houses that which possess this particular figure might have more power to, or not more power, more access to acquire imported art objects. They have more close or intense interactions with the society outside of the Yilan Plain, comparing to the houses that has this specific material that they own. They have more power to utilize local resources to make their daily activities. So we know a little bit about these all around the houses. It's between different houses, and then they have different ability to acquire different resources. Also, and it's probably associated their ability to claim their ancestry on the hill, whether they are more. In my dissertation, I try to argue this zoanthropomorphic images indicates that these houses who own these images probably can claim longer history of their households, which can be exemplified in different ethnographic data in Taiwan and Southeast Asia. So that's about the social organization of the sites. And then in terms of the ceramic assemblage, we conducted a few thin sections. So most of the ceramics in this area are locally made. So they can acquire the clay from the plant area. And few of them are imported from either the southern part or northern part of Taiwan. And based on the morphology of the ceramic jars, and these tools, they have close interactions with the sites in northern and eastern part of Taiwan, but they use local material to make these jars and the artifacts. And there are not big differences because of the nature of the sites. So most of the ceramic artifacts are broken shards, very broken. So we did thin sections and then can realize the sources of the clay, but not much stylistic analysis can really be compared to other areas. But we found like ceramic artifacts that associated their daily life, the jars for cooking, for storing, and for serving different kinds of shapes of ceramic assemblages.
Thank you. Were there any analysis of faunal and botanical analysis for what kinds of resources they were exploiting around the environment?
Due to the, we are conducting residue analysis at this moment. I'm working on the lithic tools, and one of the students is also in New Zealand is also working on the lithic material and ceramic material to try to see the residue from these tools and the jars in order to say about their food waste or the subsistence activities that might be associated with the people there. But because it's rescue excavations, especially it's in the late 1990s, so we didn't collect soil sample at that time. And so no flotation was being done at the site. So we didn't have any plant remains microscopically. And in terms of the fauna remain, probably because it's because of the same reason as the human skeletons, it's now preserved at the site. So we didn't really have those type of evidence at this moment. Maybe I'm conducting some residue analysis and I found some starch grains from the lithic tools, but it's still in a very preliminary stage. I'm still working on the paper right now.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I have a lot of questions, but
we can talk about it.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned that the site was, once it was settled, there was a continuous occupation. Did you see any replacement or a transition to a different pattern, or was it just a continuous occupation of the same group of people?
That's a good question. And I'm still trying, I have to go back to the nature of the excavation itself. It's rescue excavations, and then it's being worked by amateur or local people. It's actually not many archaeologists working during the excavation at this place. So I'm hesitant to actually say about, to talk about this issue, because I think the quality of the excavation cannot help us to answer the question confidently. But I do see, you can see the from the chronology that we can see there's, even though it seems it's a continuous occupation, but there's a time period that we don't really have that much charcoals or the datings indicating that area. And then we also see from the stratigraphy that there's a subtle difference between during of this cultural layers. There's a subtle difference between the bottom part and the upper part of the cultural layers. So I think there might be some changes, but we need to work on that in more detail, and it's still a work in progress. I should say that, because this is one of the questions that I try to answer from the data, but it's in some way practically it's a little bit difficult, but maybe I cannot answer that at this moment.
Are there any similar sites with similar artifact patterns, artifact designs in Taiwan? There's the same similar time period as well.
Yeah, there's another site in the plain area. It's called Neolithic Wansan. It's the northern part. It's north of the Wansan site, and it's also excavated by me. And the dating of the site indicates it's in the later stage as when the people occupy the Wansan site. So they are at the same time, but it's more in the around the later time period. And they share similar artifacts, but there's still subtle differences. And in terms of the other sites, contemporaneous sites in Taiwan, the northern, they share lots of similar types of tools. And then you can find similar artifacts in the northern part of Taiwan and in the eastern part of Taiwan. So that was a time that the interaction between different societies very common, I think. And then we also find the nephrite. Nephrite is not locally available. It has to be imported from the eastern part of Taiwan, which is about 100 kilometers away. So, and then the shape of the pottery, the lithic tools, they all indicate that there is close interactions between this society and the other contemporaneous societies. But they use local materials to make this tool, also indicate that they interacted, but they also, those things are integrated into their daily life. And it's also part of their society. So that makes it also different from the other societies.
So would it be safe to assume that these two sites are related or ancestors of indigenous populations, indigenous groups in contemporary Taiwan?
I would say if you see these practices, it's definitely has some relationships. It's not directly descended, but it's, you see the burials close to the households, the importance of the houses, and then the way that they organize the spaces. You can see that in many contemporary indigenous societies. And it's also because of all these ethnographic data that we saw from contemporary Taiwanese indigenous societies, that we will be able to interpret the data from the site. So there's definitely relationship. You can say that it's descended, it's not directly descended, but it's definitely their ancestors. It just depends on how you define ancestry, right? And
Yeah.
and the other thing I was inspired by this this analysis is also that most of contemporary indigenous societies are in the mountainous area, meaning that they have great knowledge living in the mountainous area. And in the mountain, they also have to face the problem of the nature of the bedrock and the terrain environments. right? And the slope terrain, the problem that caused by the living on the slope terrains. These are all things that we can see how the indigenous population that they actually manage quite well in the mountainous area. And I think it's not just like happened or they just realized that in the past decades or 2 decades or past 100 years. It's probably actually longer than that. And we can see it from this Neolithic societies. It's probably not a successful story because they left the hill, but it's because they realized the danger of living on the hill and how to choose a better place, even on the hilly environment, how to choose a place. This is not a very good place in the Yilan Plain, the hill facing the northeast monsoon, the strong northeast monsoon, and then they have to face this very serious erosional problems. This is not a good area, but it doesn't mean that it's all over Taiwan. So maybe the site is 3,000, 4,000 years ago, right? So it's like a very long-term process that the indigenous people interact with the environment and then learn how to really construct a good environment to live in even in the mountainous area in Taiwan.
It's a research question in itself. Why would they settle that place when it's
Yeah.
marginal? Maybe they were pushed or interactions with other settlements in the region. And so I'm excited about mapping that abandoned village and the ethnographic village that hopefully we'll be able to visit soon, depending on the pandemic.
Yeah.
My last question, I promise,
Yeah.
and this probably my own my pet peeve about using the three-age system in Asia. We've been using and in this case, the Neolithic, and in the Philippines, the migration of Austronesian speaking peoples, and we use the term Neolithic, but it doesn't really fit this model, the characteristics that were proposed by the Scandinavian archaeology and forced upon us by early European archaeologists, and now we're using them. Then because, for example, as you mentioned, there's really, and even in the I'll use the example in the Philippines, and we say Neolithic, but we don't have any evidence of agriculture. In mainland Southeast Asia, we use the Bronze Age when there's really no rice agriculture during Bronze Age, and just to help us maybe train the next generation of archaeologists in our region, do we need to develop a more regional centric chronology and abandoning the Eurocentric model so that we're able to talk about the region itself? Because again, using the term Neolithic, for example, doesn't fit mainland Southeast Asian patterns. And Neolithic and mainland Southeast Asia is pegged at a very early age, dating as opposed to Taiwan and the Philippines.
I think we can also use the examples in Taiwan or the Southeast Asian as a way to transform people think about Neolithic, right? So in Taiwan, for example, even within Taiwan, I think when we mentioned, that's why I answered your question, what is Neolithic in Taiwan? I mentioned that the only common characteristic is, and we are sure, is the use of pottery and the use and make of the pottery. So it's one common thing about Neolithic in Taiwan. So that means in different areas of Taiwan, even when people started to use and make pottery, there are different ways of living in different parts of Taiwan. Some parts of Taiwan, they already practice agriculture. Some parts of Taiwan, they don't really have agriculture, but they receive probably the crops or some resources from other societies on the islands or even outside of the islands. So I think maybe we can actually transform the idea of Neolithic instead of thinking that as a package linking to different characteristics. Maybe for Taiwanese archaeologists, I think Neolithic represent the stage that people just use and make pottery. And then we have to explore the rest side by side, society by society. So, because I could imagine, because there's it's really different. Even in Taiwan, it's so different. And then not mentioning that if we want to incorporate the whole area, the Southeast Asia, the continental Southeast Asia or the island Southeast Asia, we see actually diversity. And what's the need to actually make more category and then categorize societies and then eventually essentialize them? I think that will be problematic. So I think I use it more loosely. And so when I talk in Taiwan, talking like Neolithic, people will like naturally think of these people can make and use pottery, but they don't really associate that with agriculture or certain kinds of social organization. Even today, as you know, in contemporary indigenous societies, they have different social organizations, different languages, different ways of conducting their daily lives, different emphasis in terms of their agricultural activities. So instead of like categorize them, I think it's probably we can try to explore more nuances between different societies and then make it more complex.
Yeah, I'm also, because I'm thinking about this in terms of how we characterize each period, and it's very rigid, because it's like you have a checkbox. And so the United States and North American archaeologists don't use the 3-age system. I think it's only in outside Europe, Africa, and Asia. I don't know in Australia if they do. But anyway, so it's something that we probably won't see happening in our lifetime, changing the term. It's pretty well established. But again, just to think about the diversity of the archaeological record, the diversity of cultures, which we cannot really put into those checkboxes. Using ceramics, the Ainu, or not the Ainu, that's the earliest earliest Japanese ceramic usage.
The Jomon.
The Jomon, yes, it's not considered Neolithic, right? So
it also depends on how you define regional, right?
Yeah, that's right.
For me, it's in Taiwan, it's region. It's a region. So
yeah.
For us, we use Neolithic in different meanings.
Yeah.
Right?
So I think for me, it's like so that regional scholarship can talk to each other, and just seeing those patterns. Thank you, James. And there's a question from Armand. Do you know any myths or stories from any of contemporary indigenous groups which may link them to the ancient Wansan people?
No. It's probably the work of archaeologists in the past, that people tend to cut off the relationship between the indigenous people and the prehistoric cultures. So now it's hard to associate any specific indigenous groups to the Wansan site. But as I mentioned earlier, I think they are probably the ancestors of all the indigenous people in Taiwan. But no specific myth or stories that specifically identify Wansan as their ancestors or their the origin stories that come from Wansan site. No.
Okay, one more just very minor detail that I probably missed during that. What's the inclination of the settlement, the hill? Because I saw the profile, and so the settlements and the burials are buried or dug into the bedrock, right? And it's sloping.
Yeah.
And so they might need there should be forest cover on top of the hill to avoid or to safeguard from runoff or flooding from heavy rains.
Yeah. So what we can see here is that it's a slope terrain, right? And then they modify the hill as as terraces. So you can see like flat areas. They modify the bedrock into different terraces. So people actually live on that small terraces. And if they have like a big forest on the hills, it might help to stabilize the soil. But you can see from the excavations that it seems that people, quite groups of people live on the hill, and then they modify the landscapes. So probably the vegetation, there are not many trees on that hills because they build houses and then they bury their deceased members around the houses. So that's why when people live there for such a long time, the erosional problem will increase, will deteriorate this environment, make it really not easy to live. So they have to make more efforts to dig down deeper to make the post. So not all the burials are dug down into the bedrock. Not all of them. Yeah. So it's probably there's like time progression that make people utilize more and more heavily on the bedrock. And so it's also the post holes. There are so many post hole clusters, but not all of them are dug into the bedrock. So it's clear from the excavations.
That's fascinating, but I assume that the settlements would be permanent and it's not just seasonal occupation.
No, it doesn't look like seasonal. Yeah.
And because of the investment associated with constructing the terrace environment, and so so in Cebu, where my first archaeological field school I supervised the site, it's what's this, there's a mystery that we want to solve because it was occupied continuously from, we call it the metal age, although it's again using the three age system that I am not in agreement with. It's especially in the Philippines because of the descriptions associated with the metal age. There's no metal in the Philippines, metal smelting, but because of the imposition of the three age system, we use it. But so we have burials up until about 1500 years ago, and then totally nothing, no other cultural deposits beyond that particular culture. And it's not like there's nothing, no resources around that. It's in the island of Cebu, northern Cebu. So we were thinking that maybe it's climatic upheaval. There was probably a flooding. So anyway, that's just similar to the absence of human activity in a particular time period in the site. Okay, so any other questions, comments? So with that, I would like to thank Professor Chiwa Chang. And for my class, we'll continue our discussion. I'll send you an email early tomorrow for instructions on our next meeting and discussions. Our next speaker will be Professor Ellen Xie of National Tsinghua. Tsinghua. And she'll talk about her work up in Chilong. And so with that, thank you again, Chiwa. And
thank you for inviting me.
See you soon again.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Aaron.